So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about retinal overlays, but I'm not really going to talk about the actual overlay technology, but instead focus on what's required in the rest of the system to actually power retinal overlays that are perfect, that are what we might call perfect visual overlays. What does that even mean? I think the technology we have today is starting to get interesting, but it has problems. It has tracking failures. It has displays that are constrained to mobile devices that we're holding in front of us. When we actually break free of all those constraints, what's the goal? What are we going after to get to this nirvana of perfect visual overlays? So my name is Jeff Powers. I'm the co-founder of Occipital. We're ARE veterans. We've been around for all 3 years. We have an application that our primary application today is 360 Panorama. It's available on Android and iPhone. It lets you take panoramas like this, real-time panorama capture. You should check it out. So back to the goal. The dream is perfectly aligned overlays that span your entire visual field. And what do we mean by that? Well, something like what Iron Man has, right? Everything in his visual field is overlaid. He can see information about the bad guys, about the objects in front of him, and they're perfectly aligned, you might assume, and so he can target with pinpoint precision. Or maybe something like Matteo's augmented city, except with eyewear, where you look at any building and the corners of that building, if it's interesting to you, have precise overlays, precise bounding box overlaid on the corners of the building so that you can see exactly which building you're getting information about. Or maybe it's something up close. Maybe you could hold out objects in front of you and have volume calculations made, or we could calculate the number of calories in something. Again, we want perfect visual overlays that aren't floating. So what do we need to do that? And what I'm going to do in this talk is going to come up with a few conclusions about what we need. So if we're building these systems over the next decade, how can we evaluate them, and how can we see if they've achieved this nirvana of perfect overlays? So we're going to come up with 4 requirements. Right now they're mysterious. Okay, so we'll start out with sort of a thought experiment. Well, we said perfect overlays. We know nothing's perfect, so is there any way we can get away with something less than perfect? I think we can. So I think what we really mean by perfect is that they're perceptually perfect, that a person can't tell that they're wrong, that they're misaligned in any way. So in other words, the human eye can't perceive any error. So this drives us to look at the human eye. What can the human eye actually do? So the human eye's precision and accuracy is dominated by what goes on at the fovea. The fovea is the part of the eye, as most of you probably know, that is the most precise. It's the part that you use for reading text, and it has the most density of photoreceptors. So let's look at the fovea. What can the fovea do? Well, this is the images like the eye might capture. The image on the right is foveated image. So you can see at the center it has more density. So that's kind of like what the retina is capturing. So what can the fovea do? Well, you use the fovea for reading, and you sort of test how well you can read by these reading charts that you see when you go get an eye test. And so maybe the place that we start for how accurate is the human eye and how much of a misalignment could it detect on a perfect overlay would be 20/20 vision. So 20/20 vision means that at 20 feet, you can read characters that are 20 millimeters tall. That's what that means definitionally. So what does that mean in terms of like a metric that we could use for AR to evaluate our trackers? Well, basically what you can infer from this 20 millimeter high metric is that the eye is actually capable, if you can see 20/20 vision, if you have 20/20 vision, that means your eye is capable of noticing the separations in the lines that make up the letters that you're looking at. And if we look at the letter E, and we look at the little corner on the side of the letter E that sort of separates the 2 lines on the right there, where I have a line pointing that says 20/7 equals 2.8 millimeters. Well, we can say that if the entire height of the letter is 20 millimeters, that separation, that gap, is about 2.8 millimeters. So for your brain to figure out that this is an E and not a B, it needs to be able to detect that separation. So we can do a little calculation using trig, and we can figure out that that means that you can see a separation of 0.026 degrees or also known as 1.5 arc minutes. Arc minute is a 60th of a degree. But wait, some people have better vision, right? 2010, and maybe better than that even. So in the case of 2010 vision, similar calculation, and now we're down to 0.79 arc minutes. So that's less than 1 arc minute. That's less than 1/60th of 1 degree. But can people see better than that? This is interesting. Remarkably, the human eye actually is very well tuned. The retina is very well tuned. And in fact, as you get much better than 2010 vision, the imaging system in the eye becomes diffraction limited. So you can actually not see any better than about 28 vision without actually having a larger eye. So if you talk to someone and they tell you, I've got 23 vision, they're lying to you. And unless they have extremely huge eyes, so check that out. And so that's pretty amazing. But is that it? I mean, is that the limit? So if we have 0.419 min arc, that's what diffraction tells us the limit is of the human eye at a typical pupil dilation. If we say that that's our target for tracking, is that good enough? Can the humans actually see even better than that? Can they see subpixel? And it turns out that let me go back to that one. But yes, people can actually see subpixels. So if you give someone a caliper, a vernier caliper, and you tell them to align 2 lines on the caliper, and you test how well they were able to do that, studies show that the best that humans can do is to align to an acuity of 0.13 min arc, which is actually subpixel. So the human brain has subpixel processing going on as well, which I think is pretty interesting. So also, if we step back and we say, given what we know about the acuity of the eye, if we say, what is the eye in terms of a camera sensor? If we were to set up a camera sensor that could actually copy the eye and actually see all the information the eye could see, and we look at the fovea as our density measure, the human eye is something like 300 megapixels. But remember, it's foveated, right? So actually, that density is actually only the center. So a real human eye doesn't capture quite 300 megapixels. So we've arrived at an interesting conclusion, I think. Since aligning an AR overlay is very much like aligning a caliper, if you can align the overlay as well as the best person can align 2 lines on a caliper, I think that's the limit. That's a good target anyways for AR overlay precision. So we should target less than 0.13 minutes of arc for our AR tracking system. So this is our first requirement. We need 0.13 minutes of arc to be able to have a precise tracking system where a person can't see the error. Or you might be able to see the error. So what next? Which systems as part of your AR engine actually need to meet this tracking criteria? Well, head tracking, right? Because you need to know if your head is moving around. You need to know what part of the scene you're gazing at. That's pretty obvious. You also need to track objects in the scene. So you need to, if you want to overlay something on an object, you need to track it. So you're going to be using some vision, right? But turns out that's not enough. If you just track the head and the objects, you actually can't do perfect overlays. And this is the reason. If a person looks from left to right, the pupil actually moves. So this is you moving your head, or moving your eye, actually. So let's say that you have some display plane, which I've drawn in red, and you have a dot on that display plane which represents a certain overlay. If we look in this first image, the overlay dot is perfectly covering the distant objects at the top which you want to overlay. So that's the edge of a building. And it's perfectly overlaid, and it's very useful to you. But then you turn your eye a little bit, and that dot on the display is no longer lined up with the scene. So if we're wanting to overlay, we need to actually track not only the head, but also each individual eye. Figure out where it's exactly located so that we can adjust the display ever so slightly to have perfect visual overlays. What if we don't track the eye? What happens then? Well, we can still do overlays, of course, right? They just might be a little bit inaccurate. So how inaccurate? If you do the trig again, it figures out that if you don't track the eye at all, the error might be actually 10 millimeters in your position of the pupil. And so you'll only be able to have perfect overlays for objects that are 300 meters away or further. So if you want to overlay things up close, you're going to need that. So what else? We need these two elements, but when is it acceptable to lose tracking in our tracking system, in our software? When can we actually lose tracking? Watch this. What just happened? Yeah, you can actually see that. So what I'm showing here is in the distance, or in the very faint image, is actually the real door. And the bright image that you see is the overlay that we generated. And if you watch this, sometimes you'll actually think that the door overlay is the correct motion path, and sometimes you'll actually think that it's the real scene in the background there. So this can actually mess with the human brain. And like it or not, the overlays that we render are going to be incorporated by the human brain into our motion tracking. And as a result, we have a responsibility to be careful and not endanger the user by having false positives in our tracking, where the tracking system makes you think that you're moving to the right, for example, when you're not. It might be something as simple as you run into the wall instead of going through the door if it's in a very dimly lit environment. Not too bad, right? Other worse situations occur. If you think that a certain car is approaching you and it isn't, then you crash. So we need to, this gives us another requirement, is that we can't really have any false positives. You know, 0 is maybe unattainable. So we need an extremely small chance for false positives. And furthermore, we need to fade out instantly if tracking fails, because we at least can let the user fall back on their normal vision system. So we need superhuman robustness. What else? What about latency? So we're talking about the acuity, we're talking about the accuracy, but how many frames per second does the system need? What is too much lag? When you think about it, we're starting at a losing position, right? I mean, photons have already arrived on the retina, and we have to receive those photons in our camera, and we need to process them, and we need to actually generate an overlay all before the human even notices that you fell behind. So how fast is that? So here's a worst case calculation for how fast that is, and I certainly hope we don't have to hit this in reality. The human eye can saccade, which means it can like look from one object to another object, at a maximum rate of 900 degrees a second, as you'll learn from Wikipedia. If you do the math, it figures out that you can determine very easily that this means that you traverse 0.13 min-arc, which we determined before, in 2.4 microseconds. So if we want to never fall behind more than 0.13 min-arc, we need to track at 415 kilohertz. No problem. Most cameras are 30 frames per second, but that's okay. We can certainly rely on other tricks. So we need microsecond reaction time, or the overlays may be laggy. Now, of course, we can have tracking systems that might actually predict motion, and so that you don't have to be caught up. And if all else fails, we can maybe plug directly into the occipital lobe where images are received, so that we can actually sort of take advantage of the latency that the brain has in getting images from the retina back to the brain. So can your AR system do this? Raise your hand if your AR system can already do this. Oh. So we have a long way to go, and let's make it happen. So thank you. As an aside, we're looking for some engineers, so check out our website. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the saccades. You know, obviously the saccades and macrosaccades are very important, but how did you conclude that during the saccade, the retina is receiving an image?
So the question is, you know, how did I conclude that during the saccade you need to be able to, you could detect registration
nothing
error.
the eye perceiving, it's just
Right.
Until it's stabilized.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think, yeah, go ahead. I think that's an aggressive limit. I think that if we could track during the saccade, we'd be golden. But I think you're probably right that we may not actually need to track during the saccade, because I think some research has suggested, right, that actually during the saccade you're not even really aware of what's happening in the scene.
So if that's the case, maybe a 5 frames per second might be good enough.
Now 5 is probably perceptible, but how many people can do 5? Okay. No, next.
Hi, my name's Andrew, and I have a occluded iris and pupil. I realized it when I was doing, making sure people were foveating on this performer image I was showing. And, for me, that means that, my eyelid's, a little bit over my pupil. And so my center of mass of the iris hops like this continuously.
Wow.
Now, I thought that was a fundamental problem when I was working on it 10 years ago. And I was wondering first, is that continue to be a fundamental problem in eye tracking? Yeah.
So is the fact that oscillation happens a problem for eye tracking? Is that the question?
It's a significant oscillation.
Yeah. So it's like, how many is it, like multiple hertz or?
It's the computer trying to figure out where the center of mass of the iris is.
Yeah.
Or the pupil. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And since my pupil has a flat line on the top of it, there's two centers of mass. So it's oscillating at whatever the computer's confused at.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm not. I can't answer that question specifically. I'm sure it is a challenge.
Secondly, you might want to check your Wikipedia article. Microsaccades happen at about that speed, but that's just what is used to maintain the object's like persistence in your vision.
Mm-hmm.
The actual saccades where you shift from like here to here to here tend to be a lot slower. So you might want to just make sure that they're not talking about microsaccades in that. And thirdly, and I hate to not be asking so many questions to be like throwing information at you, but you may have done yourself a disservice with your demo making it blue. Blue doesn't go up the where pathway, it goes down the what pathway. And because of that, we actually are able to determine things by their blueness, what they are very easily. But it's actually very difficult to tell where the thing is. So that distinguishing like what two objects are the same or not becomes a much easier task for the brain when you're talking about something in the far end of the blue-yellow spectrum. And actually when you hit it, like the fovea is all red-green and a little bit of blue, no black and white. When you hit that red-green stuff, then yeah, that it starts pinching down and you start having the accuracy that you're talking about in your slides.
Cool. Interesting. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question about, and you kind of touched on this in your talk, the fact that the brain kind of can adapt to the input. So just very quick anecdote. I used to use a HMD with a camera, and it wasn't even registered very well. It was vaguely close to where it was. It was monochrome green. But I'd wear it for 2 or 3 weeks. And after a while, I would get used to the presence of the camera. So one day I was actually just running a playback in the heads-up display. And it happened to be a recording where someone had walked to my left, pretty close, that in the recording I actually kind of dodged. Just out of reflex and being used to this, having this input, I actually dodged in real life, even though. So not only was it not registered, it was actually not even the same environment, not the same color. But I guess my question is about human adaptation. Do we really need to reach this level of fidelity, I guess? Or do you think there's some role that perception might actually fill in the gap for us?
Yeah, so the question is, do we really need to hit this? And I don't think we do. I think this is sort of like the upper bound. If we hit this, it will be perceptually, well, assuming these are good assumptions, it will be perceptually perfect. But do we need perceptually perfect for it to be useful? Probably not. Maybe some of the things about not having tracking failures or false positive tracking is something we need to hit, because otherwise we'll put people in danger. Like you said, you dodged by accident. So what if that was like putting you in danger, right? So I think we need to hit that criteria, but the 0.13 min arc I think is honestly a little absurd for something that's useful, but a good thing to target someday. Thanks. Cool. Thank you.